Imagine a Eurovision where everything that could go wrong goes wrong. 6 months ago, I opened a video with those exact words. Now that video is totally outdated because Malmo 2024, congratulations, you outdid yourself. In this video, I'm going to try and retell how Eurovision 2024 descended into total chaos. Before we get to that, make sure you've subscribed to the channel. Make sure you have notifications turned on as well. You can follow me and my editor Jay on Twitter if you like to. We also put our videos out a day early on Patreon, so if you want a bit of that, you can find a link in the description. I'm going to retell this story through my experience. I'm going to talk about everything I got up to in the week leading up to the final last Saturday, and through that lens, explain how everything went wrong. Within 3 hours of arriving in Malmo, I was in the pub with Viceminister and Pulup, and to be honest, that was the only time in the entire experience of Eurovision this year that I have felt in any way relaxed. That predominantly was because of one major elephant in the room, and we might as well address it now. For months, the tensions have been sky high around Eurovision this year, mostly because of Israel's participation in the contest in Malmo. I've done a full video on this back in January, and if you want to learn more about how Israel uses the contest politically, you can go and watch that. I'm not going to go into detail again here. For now, let's hit the key bits of context to jog our memories and then get into what happened. The Israeli song was originally titled October Rain, and both that and an alternative called Dance Forever were rejected by the EBU for having political lyrics. The stated position of the Israeli broadcaster Khan at the time was that they would refuse to change the lyrics if the songs were rejected. This meant, in theory, if the EBU rejected them, both parties would have an easy get-out-of-jail-free card that would mean Israel wouldn't participate and the EBU didn't have to make a difficult political decision. Unfortunately for them, the president of Israel himself intervened and forced the broadcaster to change the lyrics until the EBU accepted them. As a result, Israel remained in the contest. The conversation about this had already started last year, but it really massively ramped up in the few weeks leading up to the show itself. We got a statement signed by 10 of this year's artists at the end of March calling for an immediate ceasefire and the return of all hostages, before the EBU put out a statement and FAQ at the start of April condemning abuse and explaining the rationale for Israel's continued participation. Around the same time, campaigns calling for artists to withdraw and for the EBU to remove Israel from the competition dramatically escalated. This meant that everyone, from the fans to the press to the artists themselves, were on high alert from the moment they arrived at the contest. The tension could be seen everywhere, in every part of the city. There were police on every corner, often armed. I have seen more armed police this week than I have ever seen before in Europe. Venues such as Euroclub were being swept for explosives and suspicious packages in between events. Other police forces from across Europe were called in to help too. I had a bizarre experience on day one where I went into the delegation hotel for Czechia to interview Aiko to be greeted by a bunch of Spanish Guardia Civil sat in the hotel cafe. Even at this point, you were left dreading what would come when we got to the night of the first show, and that dread turned out to be justified. To briefly run down the comparatively mild incidents of Tuesday night, here's a few of the things that happened. Ireland's representative, Bambi Thug, was forced to change their makeup because it said ceasefire in Ogam script on their face. This is a 1200-year-old script which used to be used to write Irish. They received this call an hour before their stage time, despite the fact that the EBU had previously said it was no problem. For whatever reason, that decision was reversed at the last second. Simultaneously, they decided it would be a good idea to release a statement condemning Eric Saada for wearing a keffiyeh, which is a Palestinian cultural symbol, around his wrist during his performance. For context, Eric Saada is a Swedish Palestinian singer who previously represented them at Eurovision in 2011. If you're not familiar with the Streisand effect already, where trying to censor information makes it dramatically more widespread, I suggest you become familiar with it because it's going to become a theme in this video. While all of this was going on, the Israeli commentator was busy saying this about Bambi Thug.
רבים כחלק מהזהות הבינארית שלהם. הם גם מעדיפים להשחיר על ישראל. אולי נדבר על זה בהמשך. תכינו את הכללות.
More on this later. With the tensions already high after semi-final 1, I have to be honest and say I was dreading semi-final 2 from the moment I stepped in the press centre on Wednesday morning. At the dress rehearsal, the standing section in there was like nothing I have ever experienced at a Eurovision event before, and not in a good way. Between the booing, the heckling, and the loud arguments people were having while Israel was performing, the atmosphere was acrimonious, to say the least. This was matched by the live show the following evening, where you had the bizarre spectacle of a tiny corner of Israeli press in the press room, wildly celebrating their qualification, while the rest of the room pretty much universally sat in silence. All of us had friends and colleagues in the arena that night, and that meant that we already knew that the EBU had attempted unsuccessfully to filter out the booing that was present every time Israel was mentioned or when they performed. They also added fake applause and muted the audience during the show recaps in order to change the impression that came through on the TV. Meanwhile, the world's press had caught onto the story on the basis of the boos from that Wednesday night, and they approached it from a totally different angle to what Eurovision press had covered it from up until that point. It was abundantly clear to everyone familiar with the contest where these boos were directed. It was a protest against Israel's inclusion in the contest, especially with a song that was still as blatantly political as this one was. With all that in mind though, at the conclusion of the semi-final on that Thursday night, the consensus in the press room was still very much that Israel stood no chance of winning the contest. In fact, we didn't even think they were going to get close to that prospect. At that stage, I think everyone's best hope was that they would fade into mid-table obscurity in the final, which would minimize the controversy and minimize the damage that would be caused to the contest as a whole. Then, the geniuses over at the Italian broadcaster accidentally put their televoting results on screen during the end credits of the show. They showed Israel had won that country's televote by a massive landslide. If the tensions were high before this, after this they hit absolute fever pitch. But before we get on to the absolutely ridiculous events of the 10th and 11th of May, I just want to have a quick palate cleanse through the things that actually were good about this competition, because there were a few. Firstly, in terms of song diversity and quality, this is one of the strongest fields of music we have seen in years in Eurovision. In my video where I predicted who would win the contest, I named 6 songs, and I had to name 6 because it was impossible to narrow it down any more than that. It took a lot of agonizing to get to those 6, and when the winner finally came through, which was Switzerland, we can say it was a worthy winner, and I'd like to congratulate Nemo for a brilliant song and staging, and also for being one of the kindest people that I have ever met at the contest. It really felt, in addition, that the favourites really delivered this year, and we got some amazing surprises too. The staging from Ireland and Bambi Thug was one of the best I have ever seen in the contest. Every single element of this performance, from the camera shots to the choreography, had clearly been agonized over and worked on to within an inch of its life until you got something that is about as close to perfection as you're likely to get. When you combine that with someone who has the mentality and the drive to produce a quality performance that Bambi Thug does, you end up with something absolutely amazing. Speaking of staging, the technical aspects and the production of the show were incredibly strong. In my opinion, this is one of the best stages, if not the best, and certainly the best lighting options that have ever existed at the contest. I also really loved how versatile the stage was. If you think about how different the performances were from Switzerland to Sweden to the UK or Ireland or Finland, they were all totally different and often pretty complicated concepts that all were executed brilliantly on the Eurovision stage. We have come a really long way since Cornelia Jacobs sitting on a dirty rug. We should also say that Petra Mierda was a great host. Again, more than Ackerman, maybe not so great, but when you have Petra there, it doesn't really matter. It's no surprise she's now hosted the contest on 3 occasions, and to be honest, I think the European Broadcasting Union should be thanking their lucky stars that she was the host this year, because given how rowdy things got on the 10th and the 11th, there are not many people other than Petra who could have kept that crowd in control. She managed to do that, and that's because of the respect the crowd had for her personally. What I'm saying is, most of the things related to the actual broadcast production went pretty well. It was a little unadventurous, especially when it came to interval acts, but I do credit them for frantically holding the show together just enough so that it didn't completely collapse before the final was finished. It's a shame that while all of that was happening, the EBU was busy imploding. On that subject, let's talk about Friday and Saturday. The Friday morning rehearsal at Eurovision is generally a little more relaxed than the Monday and Wednesday. Obviously, we've seen all the acts by that point, so we kind of know what to expect. So we're focused more on the intervals, on the opening act, the flag parade, details like this. Then something weird happened. Well, actually a few weird things happened, but let's just do one at a time, all right? There's a lot to get through here. Joost Klein from the Netherlands was seen in the flag parade. He went on it as normal, but in the show itself, we skipped straight from song 4 to song 6 without any mention. For whatever reason, the Netherlands had not performed. The initial assumption was that there'd been some technical issue, or that they'd simply shown the wrong postcard. It isn't unheard of to have these kinds of problems at Eurovision, even just this year, Belgium performed again at the end of the show on Wednesday because they had a technical problem during their initial run-through. What made this strange was that we passed straight through and blazed on with the show without any other comment, and we in the press room started to smell a rat. At this point, we need to give the flowers to the person who was on this story first, and that was my friend GJ, who immediately started going around the room and finding out information, getting in touch with people and making headway. He had reported that the absence was due to an incident backstage within 15 minutes of Joost being skipped in that show. He is the reason people got on this story as early as they did, and a big part of the reason why the EBU was forced to make a statement 40 minutes later. This statement lit a massive fire, and speculation was further set alight when it was seen that Martin Osterdahl, the executive supervisor of the Eurovision Song Contest, was not present at the rehearsal to do his usual piece to camera before the voting. This is highly unusual, and to add to the hilarity, one of the interval acts in the show was a tribute song to him sung by Linda Woodruff, who is a comedic character by singer and songwriter Sarah Dawn Finer. It wasn't in great taste on Friday, and by Saturday it was in no taste at all, but we'll get onto that as well later. At this point, the rumour mill really got going. The most prominent stories revolved around Joost hearing a provocative comment about his parents who passed away when he was young and then responding to that, or that the incident was with a member of the Israeli delegation, or both. To be clear, none of this happened. These rumors were categorically untrue, and while at the time of recording we do not know all the details, we can absolutely say 100% these things did not happen. During that afternoon, all we could really do was wait, speak to people, try and shed light on the situation, but there was precious little information and nobody was talking. After Sweden's broadcaster SVT reported that there had been an altercation on the Thursday evening after semi-final 2, we tried to speak, and I personally spoke to some delegations who participated in that semi-final to see if they knew anything, and nobody knew a thing. There didn't seem to be any witnesses from other delegations. Time ticked on, closer and closer to that jury show in the evening, with no confirmation yet of whether Joost would perform or not. Having already missed that rehearsal, the logic was, surely he can't perform again. That statement had said he was indefinitely barred from rehearsals. The twist in the evening is that that Friday evening show is what the juries vote on, and that's 50% of the points in the contest. This meant that he was either in or out. If he didn't perform in that show and a previous clip wasn't shown, then he'd no longer be able to participate at all. The EBU needed to make a decision. Things got weirder when that afternoon the conference for the Big Five and Sweden was cancelled on the basis that the artists wanted to focus on rehearsals. The chaos just built and built it through the afternoon, and so did our anxiety levels. I had been stressed all week, and to be 100% honest, on that day there was a time when I seriously looked into booking an early flight home. Such was the level of anxiety in that room. I really wasn't sure I could handle it. The rumour mill was flying and getting more and more and more intense, and then Angelina Mango showed up and started singing Imagine by John Lennon in the press room. I don't really have any answer for this one either, but it felt a lot like violins on the Titanic. Given the disarray that the room was in at this point, and the fact that fans were queuing outside for a show where they didn't know if they were going to see one of the biggest fan favourites, the pressure was at an absolute all-time high, and we did not think it could get any worse than this. And then it did. As the clock ticked down until showtime, we waited and waited and waited for a statement from the EBU, but nothing came. Doors opened and fans were let in, and still silence. Finally, less than 20 minutes before the show began, there was a leak of a graphic that showed a grand final running order without the Netherlands, and also suggested that there were only 36 juries instead of 37. This made us think in the press room that the Netherlands had been disqualified. The reason these graphics existed, presumably, was because at some point during that day, it must have been communicated to the team that designs them that they needed to remove the Netherlands. We know that decision was later reversed because the Netherlands did vote in the jury show that night and in the grand final the following evening. Almost immediately after those graphics leaked, we got a statement from the EBU saying that Joost would not perform that night and that his semi-final 2 performance would be used instead. As I said, what we can infer from this is that at some point the EBU's position was not just to disqualify the Netherlands from the competition, but to not allow them to vote either, and to include them as part of the rest of the world vote instead. It's unclear what happened between those graphics being made and the following morning, but what we can absolutely say is this will have been a point of discussion, a point of negotiation between the broadcaster Avrotros from the Netherlands and the EBU. We know they were in crisis talks both that day and the following day. I would be shocked if this hadn't been part of it. To be honest, I think it's extraordinary that the EBU ever considered barring the country from voting. Anyway, because of how late this statement came, mere minutes before the start of the show, everyone was already in the room. So, you can imagine how that went down.
The Dutch artist will not perform live on stage tonight.
Then, after the completion of the show and a lot of booing, everyone headed to the Euro Club. And this is where things get strange, because there were members of the Dutch delegation in Euroclub that night, and they seemed pretty relaxed. They were confident at that point that they were going to be able to participate the following day. But before we move on to that day, we need to talk about the other crisis that really reared its head towards the end of the week. The thing that took this crisis from bad to worse was the constant harassment that artists, press, delegations were receiving from the Israeli delegation. All week, artists and press had dealt with harassment and being filmed without permission by that delegation, with Bambi Thug being a particular victim of this, as I mentioned earlier. They weren't the only ones though. In addition to them, Joost was targeted, Marina Satti was targeted, and Musti from Belgium as well. As far as press goes, the targeting of one Spanish journalist on Friday was so extreme that the Spanish broadcaster put out a statement to condemn it. The press were also victims of the same covert filming that I indicated had been directed toward the artists. I witnessed this myself in the smoking area of the press centre, as did multiple colleagues. The member of the delegation, when confronted by the person being filmed when I witnessed it, quickly retreated inside and didn't deny that that was what they were doing. We know for a fact that this isn't the only incident of this that took place in that smoking area this week. On Friday evening, I reported the delegation's behaviour to the EBU myself because I didn't feel safe and I felt intimidated in what was essentially my place of work for that week. My email was never responded to this day. To be clear, the person who I spoke to was genuinely sympathetic, and I firmly believe they passed it on and they directed my concern to the right people. Somewhere along the chain, this got lost. I actually checked the following morning and asked what had happened with it, and they confirmed to me they had passed it on, they had given it to the right people. So, either implicitly or explicitly, at some point a decision was made to not protect the press from this intimidation. Given that, as we'll see from the events of final day, the artists' concerns weren't really taken seriously either, this doesn't really surprise me. So let's take stock of where we're at. It's Friday evening. The audience is absolutely irate. A fan favourite in Joost Klein has been pulled from the show moments before it is scheduled to begin. Wild rumours are flying around about why, not helped by the fact that the story breaks around 1 a.m. that the police are investigating as well. Artists and press are facing constant harassment, and the geniuses over at the Italian broadcaster have accidentally leaked a supposedly incomplete televote result that has sent everybody into a panic. Martin Osterdahl didn't do his regular piece to camera during the jury show that evening either. Somehow, this day was only about 10% as insane as what was going to follow it. On Saturday, the funny thing is, originally I wasn't even going to be in the press centre that day. I was only in the press centre because I had scheduled an interview with the Lithuanian national broadcaster. I was planning to be there for about an hour and then head home again. When I arrived, the press centre was really on edge and you could cut the tension in the air with a knife. The rest of the world voting had been delayed the previous evening, initially from midnight until 2 a.m. and then indefinitely. The reason being they still hadn't made a decision over the Netherlands. I arrived about 10 to 15 minutes before it was reported that the flag of the Netherlands had been restored to the dressing room. This gave a brief glimpse of hope for fans of the song before minutes later the EBU confirmed that Joost Klein had been disqualified from the contest. The statement issued confirmed he would no longer be able to participate in the final that evening. Remember that this is happening against a backdrop of artists and press being constantly harassed, seemingly without consequence, by the Israeli delegation. This happened despite repeated reports, and that exact same Israeli press was seen clapping and cheering when news of Joost's disqualification came through. In addition, at this point, we knew the EBU had held crisis meetings with multiple countries the night before. We know those countries now include Portugal, the United Kingdom, and Ireland. These two things came together at this point to produce an absolutely perfect storm. For context, the morning rehearsal on the day of the grand final is usually super relaxed in the press centre. As I said before, there's nothing new. We've seen the entire show. It's a chance to celebrate the music, relax with your colleagues who you've been working with all week, have a drink, much, much calmer than the rest of the day and the days preceding it. In this show, that calm lasted for all of 5 minutes. The illusion was shattered when Bambi Thug, Nemo, and Marina Satti were all absent from the flag parade. One absence probably wouldn't have raised too much concern, as it does happen from time to time, but 3, especially those 3 who had all been vocal on the issue of Israel's participation, immediately raised red flags. As it turns out, before they were due to go on stage, they had been filmed yet again without their consent by the Israeli delegation. By this point in the week, they had been filmed by multiple members of the delegation, including the songwriter of the Israeli song, Keren Pelej, who had uploaded photos of them without their consent to her story with derogatory comments attached. Bambi Thug released a statement about half an hour later confirming that because of the incident, they had missed their stage time and they'd no longer be able to rehearse in that show. Within 20 minutes of that, news broke in Ireland as well that Bambi was aware of the commentary from Tuesday night that we mentioned before, where the Israeli commentators made derogatory statements about them live on air. Bambi considered that a breach of the rules and demanded that the EBU disqualify Israel from the competition as a result. While this was going on, the show proceeded to wrap itself in layer upon layer of absolute chaos. The news that Marina, Nemo, and Bambi had been subject to harassment by the Israeli delegation, ironically, broke as no rules by Windows 95 man was being performed on stage. Martin Osterdahl missed that rehearsal as well because he had to attend yet another crisis meeting. Halfway through the show, Alessandra, who represented Norway last year, announced that she no longer felt comfortable revealing the Norwegian points, posting a statement to Instagram with the hashtag Free Palestine. Then, as Slimane from France performed his song in the a cappella bridge, he stopped singing. Instead, he started to give a speech.
We need to be united by using the yes, but with love.
Initially, his microphone seemed to be turned off, but it quickly came back on again. While it's possible that his microphone was manually switched back on, we should point out that the effects on the microphone that change through the song are pre-programmed. Therefore, the gain on the microphone would have been increased at the point where Slimane usually stepped back. This could have increased the level on the microphone again without anyone needing to manually switch it up. That said, because the microphone came back on before Slimane usually steps back, I think there is a real possibility that a producer turned it back on instead. As if intent on insulting our intelligence, having run clips from his previous performances instead of the performance from that show, in the recaps, the EBU released yet another statement. This time they said that they were made aware of the French artist wishing to speak during his act just before he went on stage during dress rehearsal 2. He wanted to save his voice and send a message of love. He will perform as normal tonight in the grand final. If this was true, his microphone would not have been turned off, and they would not have used a clip from semi-final 2 in his recap. At this point, any remaining credibility that the EBU's statements to the press had was completely lost. The narrative fell completely out of their control, and as a result, all hell broke loose. Less than an hour later, Avratros issued another statement giving more details on the incident involving Joost Klein. They confirmed there was no physical altercation, that they had proposed several alternate solutions to the EBU, and that Joost was being filmed against his will at the time. There were prior arrangements through the week that said that Joost shouldn't be filmed at that point. To be clear, this was immediately after his performance, and at that time, Joost is someone who's neurodivergent. He's very overwhelmed after the performance. It's a very intense experience. Having a camera shoved in his face was not what he wanted. The EBU had agreed that he would not be filmed at that time. This agreement was repeatedly broken. Before long, Norwegian news was calling the contest a shit show and compared the contest to a fascist state, while the Dutch commentator Cornel Maas summed things up a little more simply.
Fuck the EBU.
This isn't the last time you're going to hear someone say that in this video. That all happened around 6:50. By 7:40, Kadia, who is an associate, friend and collaborator of Joost Klein, had withdrawn from giving the finish points that night as well. In the meantime, the EBU Director General, Noel Curran, told the Swedish broadcaster SVT that they had not seen any rules broken by the Israeli broadcaster during the competition, in direct contradiction to what the EBU had indicated to Bambi Thug and Marina Satti and Nemo that morning. Bambi naturally was not happy about this and released another statement contradicting Curran's comments and saying that the EBU had told them themselves that there had been rule breaks earlier that day. They also said they had received no official update on their complaint from the organization. Meanwhile, outside, crowds were filing in for the final. Security guards escorted a fan with a non-binary flag away and took the flag off them before allowing them to enter the arena. Nemo then showed that same flag on stage during the flag parade. They had to sneak it in because they were told that they were not allowed to have it. Not to be outdone by Bambi's statement, the Dutch broadcaster had another bombshell to drop. They released another statement just a few minutes before the show, announcing that in conjunction with Nikki de Jager, who was meant to be their point spokesperson, they had decided to refuse to present the points from the Dutch jury. In the meantime, the producer on stage warming up the crowd was being booed to such an extent that he got into a dispute with them.
I don't recognize this. I've been doing Eurovision for many years. And the Eurovision tribe is not hateful people.
The show proceeded to become the farce that many suspected it would, with massive boos for the Israeli entry, which were then filtered out on television and replaced with fake applause. The EBU then refused to upload the Portuguese performance to YouTube on the basis that Yolanda's nails had Palestinian symbolism on them. The icing on the cake, though, was the fact that the Martin Osterdahl tribute, despite the events of the previous 36 hours, stayed in the show. Friends of mine who were in the room reported back to me to say that it was a very awkward silence in those few minutes. Then his piece to camera returned, and he was greeted by the loudest boos I have ever heard at Eurovision. The reports that emerged from the arena during the show were easily the worst seen during the whole week. Those who choose to silently or loudly protest Israel's inclusion were intimidated and verbally abused by other fans. The atmosphere and the whole evening made the experiences of Monday and Wednesday look like a child's playground. Fortunately for the contest, the worst case scenario did not play out. That would have been the disgraceful behavior of that delegation being validated with an Israeli victory. This would have come on the back of a televoting effort that felt more like sports doping. There are countless examples of political parties and leaders bragging about not even watching the show, but sending the maximum number of votes possible to Israel and encouraging their supporters to do the same. In addition, adverts featuring the Israeli artist gained millions of views online. As shown in this video, the adverts were placed by the Israeli government advertising agency. Given the volume of views that these adverts received, we can safely assume that at least $1.5 million was spent promoting the song in YouTube ads to users. Had this effort succeeded and had Israel won the contest, it would have presented a critical threat to Eurovision's continued existence, at least in the form that we know it. Not only would the unacceptable behavior that I've mentioned have been rewarded, we would have faced a contest in 2025 that had the potential to be hosted in the backdrop of human rights violations that have been widely documented by many international organizations. It also felt like an existential moment for Eurovision fan media. After the experience of recent months, many of us, myself included, felt more that we would simply walk away from the contest rather than cover it while it's being hosted in Israel in the current circumstances. That meant Saturday night concluded mostly with relief. Relief that while the very strong televoting performance from Israel did materialize, the jury score was low enough that they had no chance of winning. They were also denied the televote victory by Croatia and Baby Lasagna, and the optics of that are so important. There is a massive difference between coming second in the televote and winning it in terms of the kind of story you can sell. The backlash of how the last few days at the contest were handled, though, was only just beginning at this point. The EBU completely lost control of every aspect of the contest this year, disqualifying one artist on the basis of having zero tolerance for abuse or harassment, while having ample tolerance of it when it was directed at other artists or at press by the Israeli delegation, as was a consistent theme throughout the entire week. From a communications perspective, the failure of the organization to effectively go into crisis mode at any stage was utterly damning. Scheduled posts simply continued to go out, even when they were in extremely bad taste. The posting on the official account of Nemo with a non-binary flag, hours after that exact same flag was confiscated on entry to the arena, went down like a lead balloon, as it should have. The EBU never acknowledged any fault for this, and they never apologized publicly for this happening. They appeared obstinate and stubborn and unwilling to engage with press or artists in a meaningful way. This attitude resulted in audiences being informed minutes before shows started that a fan favorite would not be performing, and that went down exactly as we expected it to. You can see this in the response to the statements that have been put out over the last few days. They have only served to further anger and further antagonize the Eurovision audience, both on the ground and online. The same has been true in the week since the contest. A statement was made, very vaguely saying that some delegations didn't respect the spirit of the rules, both on site and during their broadcasts, and that this would be reviewed to move forward in a positive way and ensure the values of the event are respected by everyone. At this moment, this simply doesn't wash. Nothing we have seen at this point gives us confidence that the current setup at the EBU is equipped to deal with this appropriately. Even now, artists and delegations are coming out in ever greater numbers to share their experiences. From Norway's Gorta being given guarantees around freedom of speech that weren't followed, to Aliona and Jerry from Ukraine being explicitly banned from making the kind of gestures that were at the very heart of the contest in 2022 and 2023, to multiple delegations adding their voice to the official complaints that the EBU have received about the Israeli delegation. Sylvester Belt from Lithuania went as far to admit that he wished he hadn't qualified from the semi-final because he was so desperate for the experience to be over. Bambi Thug's emotional post-contest interview, where they said the same three words that Cornel Mars did earlier,
"The EBU is not what the Eurovision is. Fuck the EBU. I don't even care anymore,"
is entirely understandable. It was the response of someone who has faced constant harassment for weeks and months and constantly been failed by the organization that is meant to be protecting them from it. This is the most unforgivable part of all. The total failure to provide safeguarding to artists and to press who were targeted and victimized in their place of work for the duration of the contest. Even after several reports were made, we now know that Avrotros, the Dutch delegation, reported this twice during the week because they weren't satisfied with how it was handled the first time they did it. The failure to respond or even acknowledge concerns in writing paints a picture of an organization that, rather than engaging with criticism and solving the problems behind it, prefers to hide and pretend the problems aren't there. We shouldn't blame the audience for booing during the Israeli act or booing Martin Osterdahl. Instead, the blame lies with the EBU. They accepted a clearly political Israeli participation in the contest this year. Simultaneously, while accepting this political participation, spent huge amounts of energy suppressing every tiny statement, every tiny gesture from other participants who wanted to put forward their own message in response. They then spent none of that energy protecting those artists from the very thing they were trying to raise concerns about. In terms of where we go from here, the most immediate and obvious conclusion is that Martin Osterdahl's future as the executive supervisor of the Eurovision Song Contest is completely untenable. To be honest, I don't think he's going to be the only person leaving the organization in the near future either. Under his leadership, the EBU's credibility has completely disintegrated, especially this year. Secondly, the EBU should fall over itself to make sure that the Netherlands does not withdraw from the competition altogether. This means organizational and procedural change, but it also means offering them an automatic qualification spot for next year's contest by way of apology for how this situation was handled. In addition, I cannot say this more clearly, the EBU has to take action against Kant, the Israeli broadcaster, for its repeated, documented breaches of the rules that took place during Eurovision week. Given the number of breaches, in my opinion, a suspension from the contest is the only option. That kind of behavior simply cannot be allowed to exist in the Eurovision bubble. If it is, we risk jeopardizing the continued existence of the event. Artists and delegations will simply refuse to allow themselves to be put in that dangerous a position. I didn't want to have to make a video like this after Eurovision, but I genuinely have never experienced a week like the one I have just had in Malmö. In my opinion, the contest cannot survive another year like this. That means the EBU has to take action, and they can't rely on hoping the geopolitical context changes to bail them out. Almost everything that occurred this week could have been avoided had the EBU taken the action that was very, very obviously necessary at an early stage. Because they failed to do so, this year's contest took us to the very brink. Luckily for us and the EBU, not so much for our wallets, the contest will survive as it goes to Switzerland next year. An ironically neutral winner in a year where neutrality was far, far away. The EBU has a chance to do things right and ensure that we don't have the disaster like we had this year. We can start on that track by removing the people who were responsible for that happening. We will be watching closely, but in the meantime, it's time to take a breath breath and prepare ourselves for the year ahead. When the dust settles in 2 weeks, I do plan to make a slightly more light-hearted video, which I originally planned for today, where we'll be talking about the winners and losers at Eurovision this year. Given the circumstances, it simply didn't feel appropriate to make that the topic of today's video. Until 2 weeks from now, I want to say thank you again for all of the support during this season. It is massively appreciated. Please do share this video if you can, and please do subscribe to the channel so we can do this all the way through until 2025. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.